Oi, todo mundo, boa tarde. Bom, vamos começar, né? Já estamos aqui no horário. Primeiro, agradecer a presença de todo mundo. Sei que é final de ano, né? Aquela correria básica. Mas muito obrigada pela presença de todo mundo nessa conferência com o professor Frédéric Keck. Eu vou explicar rapidinho, né? Apresentar um pouco o Frédéric e explicar também o âmbito da visita dele aqui ao Brasil. Depois passar a palavra para ele, para a gente escutá-lo. Bom, o Frédéric Keck é um pesquisador sênior do Laboratório de Antropologia Social. Depois de estudar filosofia na École Normale Supérieure em Paris e antropologia na Universidade de Califórnia, em Berkeley, ele conduziu pesquisas sobre a história da antropologia social e questões biopolíticas contemporâneas levantadas pelo estudo das zoonoses. Foi diretor do Departamento de Pesquisa do Museu do Quai Branly entre 2014 e 2018. No campo da história intelectual, eu acho que isso aqui no Brasil muita gente o conhece por conta dessa trajetória também, publicou diversos trabalhos sobre o desenvolvimento da antropologia francesa e sua relação com a filosofia, explicando as ideias de autores como Auguste Comte, Lucien Lévi-Strauss, Émile Durkheim e Claude Lévi-Strauss. Sobre a obra desse último, escreveu uma introdução publicada no Brasil em 2013 pela editora Contraponto. Keck, Frédéric, é o pesquisador responsável por uma parte de um projeto de pesquisa sobre as coleções etnográficas de Dina e Claude Lévi-Strauss, que envolvem o MAE-USP, então por isso estou aqui também, Maria Luísa Lucas, professora do MAE-USP, o Museu do Quai Branly e o LAIS, o Laboratório de Antropologia Social. É nesse contexto que o Frédéric visita a USP e realiza essa conferência hoje, depois vai passar por São Carlos, Santa Catarina, Salvador, vai fazer um tour no Brasil até o fim da semana que vem. Bom, esse projeto que eu estava comentando com vocês tem como principal objetivo conhecer melhor essa coleção do Claude Lévi-Strauss e da Dina Lévi-Strauss, coleção essa que está dividida entre o Brasil e a França, entre o MAE e o Museu do Quai Branly, e a gente está mais interessado nesse momento nesses objetos coletados pela Dina e pelo Claude Lévi-Strauss na primeira viagem de campo, em 1935-36, quando o Claude Lévi-Strauss era professor aqui na USP, como muitos de vocês sabem também. A partir dessa investigação coletiva, que envolve várias pessoas, algumas das quais estão aqui também na sala, a gente está interessado em explorar outras vertentes, né, para pensar essas coleções que ainda não foram investigadas e em trabalhar junto dos povos indígenas envolvidos nesses objetos ou concernidos nessas coleções, para entender também como eles pensam essa coleção e como ela pode ser mobilizada no futuro. Eu vou, então, passar a palavra para o Frédéric, que vai fazer a intervenção dele em inglês. E depois da fala dele eu vou fazer um breve comentário, tentando também conectar com esse contexto mais geral do projeto, e depois a gente abre para perguntas do público.
Thank you all for coming tonight for this conference, and I want to thank Maria Luisa for allowing me to meet Boho in Paris a month ago and see how they made these featherworks, and now to come to São Paulo and see the collections that Lévi-Strauss made from his expeditions with the Boho in 1935. So what can we see in the featherworks collected by Dina and Claude Lévi-Strauss during their field trip among the Boho? This question raised by the project Coleções, compartilhadas can be taken through different angles. In the tradition of material culture and history of sciences, one can ask under which condition and through what kind of classificatory gaze these collections have been made and conserved. In a tradition of literary studies and art history, one can ask what was the imaginary of birds and feathers Lévi-Strauss carried from poetry and painting into the assemblage of Boho featherworks. Since I am a philosophically trained anthropologist working on zoonosis, that is, on pathogens transmitted across animal species, I will ask a different question. How did Lévi-Strauss consider these collections as a reservoir for the imagination of future threats? This question combines art history and history of sciences to understand how the materiality and the imaginary of these featherworks were inscribed in Lévi-Strauss's epistemological and political reflection on science, which was probably the most durable heritage of structural anthropology. I am borrowing to Patrice Maniglier his ideas on the enigmatic life of science, and he was touring Brazil just before I came. And he's been a close partner of discussion and reading in the last 20 years. I will explore in this talk the semiotic of birds as a sentinel species, that is, as carrying early warning signals of an impending disaster. I want to argue that Lévi-Strauss's reflection on birds is different from those of other anthropologists in that he viewed birds as carrying signs of a disaster that would later affect humans. Reading Lévi-Strauss through the notion of disaster is a recent trend in the contemporary literature on his work and gives a deep meaning to the analogies made by Lévi-Strauss between the genocide that affected Amerindian groups and the Shoah that affected European Jews. By putting these reflections on disasters in the light of my own work on pandemics coming from animals, I want to examine 3 different moments in the career of Lévi-Strauss. His discussion with Lévi-Brühl on the famous Boro parakeets in the 1930s, his article on mad cow disease in 1996, and his articulation of the concept of semiotic reserve in La Pensée Sauvage in 1962. Hence the title of my talk, Red Parakeets, Cannibal Cows, and Animal Reservoirs in the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss. So as you see, I will disrupt the chronology of Lévi-Strauss's career, so from the beginning to the end and then back to the middle, to privilege the conceptual work on the notion of sentinel species. So back to 1910. In How Natives Think, his first ethnological book of a series on primitive mentality, which would count 6 books published between 1910 and 1938, Lucien Lévi-Brühl quoted the German ethnologist Karl von den Steinen in his 1894 book Unter der Naturvölker Zentralbrasiliens. I quote, "The Trumai, a tribe of the north of Brazil, say they are aquatic animals. The Boro, a neighboring tribe, boast that they are rad araras parakeets. This does not merely signify that after their death they become araras, nor that araras are metamorphosed boros and must be treated as such. It is something entirely different. The boros, says von den Steinen, who would not believe it, but finally had to give in to their explicit affirmations, give one rigidly to understand that they are araras at the present time, just as if a caterpillar declared itself to be a butterfly." Trained in Kantian philosophy and teaching at the Sorbonne University, Lévi-Brühl thought that a statement such as "Boro are parakeets" was transgressing the principle of contradiction, since it claimed that humans are non-humans. Of course, this notion of humans was not used at the time, as in contemporary anthropology, but it's really the idea that you cannot be human and non-human at the same time. Quoting the sociologist Émile Durkheim, who was his friend at the École Normale Supérieure, Lévi-Brühl explained this statement by the intervention of collective representations, which instituted a participation, that was Lévi-Brühl's notion, of human beings to the totemic principle of the group. Lévi-Brühl thus criticized Edward Tylor, a conception of animism, the founder of British anthropology, which relied on his view of an individualistic psychology of belief, attributing a soul to inanimate things. For Lévi-Brühl, the statement, "Boro are parakeets," indicated not only a way to give names and make kins, but more deeply, a mystical community instituted by the perception of invisible connections between separate beings under a collective principle. And I read the end of the quote. "This is not a name they give themselves. This is not a kinship they proclaim. Mr. von den Steinen deems unconceivable that they are at the same time human beings and birds with red feathers. But for mentality ruled by the law of participation, there is no difficulty. Every totemic society has collective representations of the same kind, involving a similar identity between the individuals of a totemic group and their totem." So animals, Lévi-Brühl argued, are not only symbols of the group produced by the collective ritual of sacrifice, as showed by Durkheim, they also carry signs of a potential future, interpreted by techniques of divination, interpretation of dreams, or witchcraft. This analysis received many echoes in 20th century philosophy, opening different ways to link philosophy and anthropology in the treatment of apparently irrational statements. For analytic philosophers, this statement was, following Brian Wilson's introduction to the collective book Rationality in 1970, I quote, "the thing to be exercised." After Edward Evans Pritchard had argued in the 1950s that statements such as twins are birds required a new mode of understanding for mystical connections in ethnographic context, William Quine and Donald Davidson were quoted in the 1980s for arguing that it was caused by a mistake of translation. A principle of charity, Davidson said, was necessary to maximize the rationality of apparently irrational beliefs. For phenomenologists, this statement could only be understood if the ethnographer criticized the natural attitude of scientific knowledge and returned to what Edmund Husserl called a lived world, a Lebenswelt. In the 1950s, phenomenologists such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty and Jean-François Lyotard quoted the letters sent by Edmund Husserl to Lucien Lévi-Strauss in 1935 to support the link between philosophy and anthropology in the description of this lived world, which Merleau-Ponty characterized as the flesh of the world or a wild being. Claude Lévi-Strauss took a different step from these philosophical treatments of the statement, "Boro are parakeets." Doing fieldwork in Amazonia at the end of the 1930s, with the blessing of Lucien Lévi-Strauss, who was then one of the heads of the Institute of Ethnology of the University of Paris, with Marcel Mauss and Paul Rivet, Lévi-Strauss discovered that the problem raised by this statement was not the logic of contradiction, but the semantic of oppositions. Lévi-Strauss thus returned to the original method of Karl von den Steinen, who, in the tradition of German cultural philosophy, was looking for differences between groups, and who noticed that the difference between the Boro and the neighboring groups was indicated by the difference between birds and what von den Steinen called aquatic animals, and which was probably capybara. So I read von den Steinen, the Trumai are aquatic animals because they sleep on the depths of the river. This is what the Baikiri say very seriously, because von den Steinen was traveling with a Baikiri informant and never actually talked either with the Boro or with the Trumai. We find in other tribes this belief that humans sleep in water. The Boro pretend that it is possible to spend hours under the surface of the water after eating some leaves and catch fish. So the von den Steinen idea is that the difference between the Trumai and the Boro is indicated by this difference between being a fish, being a capybara that catches fish, or being a bird that flies from trees. And these are different ways to gain power and affirm one's superiority. So it's a reversible statement. When you analyze the social organization of the Boro and the rituals in which they displayed featherworks, Lévi-Strauss noticed that in this society, humans were not identified with birds in general, but with parakeets of a certain color, by distinction with parakeet of another color. And so the colors of the featherworks are related to clans, as we saw in the discussion with the Boro in Paris. So in his foundational article published in 1936, Contribution à l'étude de l'organisation sociale des Indiens Boro, Lévi-Strauss showed that the Boro are divided into 2 clans and 3 castes, and that the ritual in which they dress with feathers of these different groups must overcome the opposition between these groups and the contradiction between equality and inequality in their social structure. So this solution to the logical problem raised by Lévi-Strauss combined the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure and the political analysis of Karl Marx. Lévi-Strauss could thus raise a strong criticism of the functionalist and phenomenologist called readings of Lévi-Strauss, which attempt him to understand from within the emotions that explain the participation of individuals to the totemic group. And that is a famous quote from La Pensée Sauvage. Wild thought, La Pensée Sauvage, is logical in the same sense and the same way as ours, but only when ours is applied to knowing a universe in which it recognizes both physical properties and semantic properties. Once this misunderstanding is dispelled, it still remains the case that, contrary to the opinions of Lévi-Brühl, this thinking proceeds on the path of understanding, not of affectivity, by means of distinctions and opposition, not through confusion and participation. In the 1970s, a student of David Maybury Lewis at Harvard University, Christopher Crocker, did fieldwork among the Boros and presented his first results at Lévi-Strauss' seminar at the Collège de France. He noticed a distinction between women and men. While men were hunting birds, women were domesticating them, and often the feathers from the birds actually come from the domesticated birds. And we see in the film made by Lévi-Strauss a parakeet on the roof of a Boro house. So when women said that Boro men were birds, it meant, for Crocker, that they were domesticated like birds. So Crocker could famously argue that the statement Boro are parakeets was not a contradictory belief, but a metaphor, a way of displacing relations between men and women in relation between living beings, or between humans and birds. Lévi-Strauss had already noticed that our powers were consumed by the Boro either as wild or as domestic, but this dichotomy between wild and domestic birds and between men and women was outside of his analysis. In his book entitled Vital Souls, published in 1985, Crocker analyzed the cosmology of the Boro through the distinction between two principles: Awe, an immutable logical form, and Bope, the flux of daily life. In the summary he made of this book at the Collège de France in 2017, Philippe Descola argued that the Boro thus mixed a totemic ontology of Awe, the logical form, and an animistic ontology of Bope, the flux of life, with two kinds of shamans, those who decontaminate food and those who celebrate the liturgy. Animals, for the Boro, thus have a double life. They can be Bope, such as animals hunted for food, or they can be Awe, such as animals hunted for revenge. And so Descola argues that the birds are perceived as signs in a lived environment, but also as segments in the temporal continuity of ancestral life. So this very rich ethnography of the cosmology of the Boro leaves aside the question of death and the afterlife, which is at the center of more recent ethnography of this group. And I will stop here my analysis of the rich debates on the Boro, because this is an ongoing research, and I just wanted to put on the table the different interpretations that have been made of the relations between the Boro and the parakeets. So after summarizing all these debates on the famous statement, Boro are parakeets, I now want to turn to my own ethnography of zoonosis in South China, so a very different field from Amazonia and Mato Grosso. This ethnography came from a very simple observation. While European societies faced the massive killing of cows at the end of the 1990s, in the wake of the mad cow disease crisis, Asian societies faced the massive killing of birds, particularly chicken, to protect them, to protect humans from an avian influenza pandemic. So, if you want, this was a structuralist hypothesis. When animals are killed to prevent a disease transmitted from animals to humans, cows are for Europe what birds are for Asia, very roughly. And Europe is Europe is the name of a deity that is carried by Zeus in the shape of a cow. So there's a long history of cow breeding in Europe that probably led to the very emotional signification of mad cow disease in Europe. So, and I was interested to see how the same phenomenon of killing cows was interpreted differently by Asian societies who don't think that the same phenomenon killing animals was interpreted differently in different societies, in Asian societies that don't think that birds are sacred in the same way as European societies think cows are sacred. Following the indications of Paul Rabinow, Andrew Lakoff, and Stephen Collier on biosecurity, I showed that what was at stake in the management of zoonosis was not what Foucault called pastoral power, that is, a technique to manage populations by risk calculation, using sacrifice as an ultimate strategy, but rather what I called, following philosopher Grégoire Chamaillou, a synergetic power, that is, a technique of disaster mitigation taking the perspective of animals to use them as early warning signals. Hence my focus on the ethnography of sentinel species. Animals carrying signs of zoonotic pathogens in farms or laboratories, allowing virologists to raise alarm on potential pandemic. For instance, in Hong Kong poultry farms, unvaccinated chickens are called sentinels, and the Chinese term is xiaobingji, which literally means chicken whistling like soldiers. So there's a discourse of the war against the virus as an enemy, and the animals as allied of humans in this war with the virus. So that virus hunters, that's the name the virologists give themselves, can find the traces of avian influenza viruses circulating on the territory. And another instance, another example, in laboratories in Vietnam, chickens are genetically modified to lure the influenza virus in its potential transmission to pigs and humans. And lure is also a vocabulary from hunting. My reflection on sentinel species has been inspired by Lévi-Strauss's analysis of mad cow disease in 1996. In an article published in the Italian journal La Repubblica, later published in French by Études Rurales in 2001, under the title La leçon de sagesse des vaches folles, Wisdom Lessons of Mad Cows, Lévi-Strauss reflected on the fact that cows were qualified as cannibals because they were fed with animal foodstuff, which led to the transmission of scrapie, an animal disease known by veterinarians since the 18th century in sheep. So we must notice that Lévi-Strauss knew about this neurodegenerative disease because he had followed in the 1960s the work of Carlton Gajduzek, a virologist, Austrian-American living in Australia. This has been narrated by Warwick Anderson, the historian of medical sciences, under the title Collectors of Lost Soul. A very interesting figure. So this virologist studied the transmission of kuru in Papua New Guinea and showed that the disease was transmitted to foreign women by endo-cannibalistic practices, that is, the consumption of the flesh of the dead members of the group. Lévi-Strauss thus argued that if mad cow disease was linked to the transformation of cows into cannibals, cows had been fed with animal foodstuff since the beginning of the 20th century, it didn't mean that they were denaturalized monsters, but on the contrary, that they should be included into human societies in the same way as cannibalistic societies introduce their enemies into the group by eating them. So it connected exo-cannibalistic practices of Amazonia with endo-cannibalistic practices of Papua New Guinea. And we must remember that Lévi-Strauss gave a course on cannibalism in the Collège de France in 1978, which was very important to put together very scattered reflections on cannibalism, particularly in Triste Tropique, comparison between putting people in prison and eating people as enemy. So, in order to avoid public health crises such as mad cow disease, unanimously recognized as caused by industrial system of animal production, Lévi-Strauss suggested in this article, 1996, that cows should be released in the wild and hunted, and that some of them should be kept in the human society and fed with cow with cow meat to monitor the health of the herd. He thus suggested to introduce within industrialized system techniques of surveillance from societies where the distinction between wild and domestic animals is not so neatly made. So cannibal cows in Lévi-Strauss's utopia, it's an imaginary of the future, plays the role of sentinel animals in the sense that I have studied in my ethnography of avian influenza in South China. They are animals positioned on the front line between industrialized societies and wild nature in such a way that they capture the early warning signals of diseases coming from the wild and amplify by the industrial system. While these signs are perceived as those of the enemy, for instance, when a zoonotic pathogen, such as H5N1 or SARS-CoV-2, is treated by health authorities as a threat that must be eradicated, virologists are those who can trace the chain of signaling that leads these signs to be pathogenic. So this is a question that has fascinated me and that has also inspired Lévi-Strauss in his own reflection on microbes. Several texts on microbes at the end of Lévi-Strauss's life. If microbes are living beings with which humans and humans must cohabit, what are the mechanisms that make them pathogenic, and how can we unroll this chain of signaling that prevents them from being pathogenic? In other words, if microbes send the signs of the potential cohabitation between humans and animals, how can we read these signs in a map of relations where life and death are at stake? So my ethnographic work has led me to build a link, unexpected link, between anthropology, microbiology, and immunology through the notion of sentinel species that I would never have been able to find in my philosophical work on Lévi-Brühl and Lévi-Strauss. But this has also helped me to frame the genealogy of French anthropology in a different light. Coming back to the work of Lucien Lévi-Brühl, I have showed that he was himself very aware of the development of microbiology and immunology through his son Marcel, who was working on zoonotic pathogens with Charles Nicolle at the Pasteur Institute. I therefore hypothesized that Lévi-Brühl's discussion with Pasteurian microbiology shed a light on his engagement on the Dreyfus affair. So just a short summary of the Dreyfus affair, because I dived into the Dreyfus affair for 10 years because I wrote a history of the Lévi-Brühl family from a political perspective, and the Dreyfus affair is a constant memory for this family. So this family is quite famous because the son of Lucien Lévi-Brühl, Henri, is a sociologist of law, and his grandson is a sociologist of statistics. And I also work with his great-grandson, who is an epidemiologist. And they told me about the memory of the Dreyfus affair. So the Dreyfus affair starts in 1894, when Alfred Dreyfus is accused of betraying the French army because a document has been found with secrets on the movements of the French army in the German embassy in Paris. And so Dreyfus is accused on the basis of the similarity between his writing and the writing on the document. There is a military trial. He's accused of treason, sent to Cayenne, where he spends 4 or 5 years. And then there is a second trial, 1898, in Rennes, because a lot of academics have been involved in the affair, showing that Dreyfus' writing was not the same as the writing of the document. And among these academics, there are historians. Gabriel Monod is the most famous, but there are also microbiologists, particularly Émile Duclos, who was the founder of the Pasteur Institute, and who basically argued that if the French army didn't use scientific proof in this case of who wrote the document, then they would lose the war against Germany because Germany based its military organization on science. So there was this challenge of, are we trusting irrational accusations from the Catholic hierarchy, or are we trusting science to solve this problem? And Lucien Lévi-Brühl was involved at the very beginning of the Dreyfus affair in 1894 because he was the cousin of Alfred Dreyfus by marriage, and as a professor of moral philosophy at the Sorbonne, he was the witness of Alfred Dreyfus in his first trial, 1894. And he said that he believed Dreyfus was innocent. And then in 1898, since he was a friend of Jean Jaurès, leader of the Socialist Party, he pushed Jaurès to not only bear witness, but defending Dreyfus against the accusations of the army. So, I come back to my text because it was so evident that I jumped to the conclusion. But all this is available in a book that you can download online, which is called How French Modern Think, the Lévi-Brühl family from primitive mentality to contemporary pandemics. Because I try to argue that this memory of the Dreyfus affair also explains the engagement of the Lévi-Brühl family in what are called systems of vigilance or techniques of vigilance. So that's the conclusion. As a cousin of Alfred Dreyfus and a friend of Jean Jaurès, Lévi-Brühl supported the idea that Dreyfus should not be sacrificed for the defense of the French nation, but should be considered as a sentinel of new forms of justice to come. And this is an idea illustrated by caricatures of Dreyfus and Jaurès as birds, with an ambivalent meaning. Are these birds spies working for the enemy, or signs of coming disasters, such as a war with Germany? I spent a lot of time asking myself why Lévi-Brühl was so focused on boho or parakeets. You know, what did Lévi-Brühl think about the contradiction for humans to be birds? And then when I discovered these caricatures of Jaurès and Dreyfus as birds, I made the connection. There were many caricatures circulating at the time of the Dreyfus affair, but most of the caricatures were portraying humans as pigs, particularly if you think of Émile Zola. And this is a very animalizing caricature, a very derogative caricature, whereas this caricature is more ambivalent. So I made the hypothesis that this imaginary of birds as ambivalent sign carriers influenced Lévi-Brühl's philosophical analysis of the statement, boho are parakeets. While many historians have traced the roots of Durkheimian sociology to the nostalgia of small Jewish communities of Alsace-Lorraine, Durkheim, Lévi-Brühl came from the lost area of Alsace-Lorraine, I suggested that the roots of French ethnology should be found rather in the experience of Alfred Dreyfus, an emancipated Jew from Alsace-Lorraine, who was suddenly confronted with archaic forms of accusation. And this led me to trace a deep link between Lucien Lévi-Brühl and Claude Lévi-Strauss, despite their philosophical disagreements. These are images of Dreyfus in Cayenne, and a quote that I found in all the letters that were sent to Alfred Dreyfus when he returned to Cayenne. And this is by, so his name is Jean Psychari, but he's a Greek linguist. He's the guy who invented the modern Greek language, Johannes Psychari. And he was one of the Dreyfusards. And then he sent a letter to Dreyfus saying, every Frenchman must be grateful to you. You have been there like a soldier at his post. As an advanced sentinel, you have seen the day of justice shine. I also came to think about the memory of the Dreyfus affair because many critiques of colonization during between 1900 and 1920 often refer to the Dreyfus affair with the argument what the French army did to Alfred Dreyfus, which was, of course, very known, very public, through the Dreyfus affair, was done ordinarily in other prisons or other bagnes, such as, and this has been showed by Dominique Khalifa in his work on the bagne, particularly in French Algeria. And another proof of this signification of the Dreyfus affair is a testimony from Monique Lévi-Strauss about what her husband said about the Dreyfus affair. So his parents were, of course, very involved in the Dreyfus affair. Then they lost track of the socialist movement in which they were involved in the defense of Dreyfus. But Lévi-Strauss said that when he was in Amazonia, he felt like Dreyfus in Cayenne. So this experience of an emancipated Jew in the French Republic and coming to the lands of South America and sharing the experience of colonial subject, in my view, is foundational for French anthropology. So this doesn't mean that Lévi-Strauss felt Amazonia was a prison, but rather that it was a sentinel post in which he could observe the signs of disasters to come in the movement of living beings around him. So rather than through a nostalgia of primitive past, I think we should read French ethnology through the necessity to prepare for a coming disaster by mapping the imaginary of relations to mitigate the catastrophic consequences of this disaster. And this connects to what I said in the introduction about the Shoah, which for many historians of the Jewish condition the Shoah was announced by the treatment of Alfred Dreyfus, giving rise also to Zionism and so on. So that's the connection I make between Lévi-Strauss' philosophical thinking and the experience of Dreyfus in Cayenne. And now I move to the third part. So the two ends, beginning of 20th century, end of 20th century, what happens in 1962 when Lévi-Strauss is at the summum of his anthropological career, and when he publishes what I think is his best book, his most dense book, La Pensée Sauvage. So you might know that La Pensée Sauvage has been translated in English in a good edition recently by Chicago University Press. There was a very bad translation published in 1968, actually by a student of Rodney Needham. And Rodney Needham was in conflict with Lévi-Strauss, so he pushed a young analytic philosopher who constantly criticized Lévi-Strauss for being obscure, and the translation, of course, is very obscure. And now we have a new translation, Wild Thought. So the first translation was Savage Mind, and the new translation respects the idea that La Pensée Sauvage is not a form of mind, but it's a way to think about natural species. And it's much clearer. So I will quote Wild Thought from University of Chicago Press, 2021. So in the third part of this talk, I will not read La Pensée Sauvage through the concept of sign, which was what I did in the first part, but through the concept of reservoir that I found in my work with microbiologists. So by the term pensée sauvage, Lévi-Strauss meant not modes of thinking of savages, but thinking in a sylvatic environment, pensée à l'état sauvage. He argued that when it finds itself in a forest, rather than in a blind countryside, human thinking is not finalized by a performance objective, but elaborates a set of classifications from animals and plants to solve all kinds of problems. According to Lévi-Strauss, Indian societies in the southeastern United States identify animals and plants in their environment to diagnose and treat disease, and, I quote, these societies treat pathological phenomena as the consequences of a conflict among men, animals, and plants. Irritated by humans, animals send them diseases, plants the allies of humans, counterattack by providing remedies. So this formulation of what Michel Foucault has called a biopolitical problem resonates strangely with some of the statements we have heard about the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, bats or pangolins have been said to revenge against humans, and mink corpses emerging from Danish soil after slaughter, as well as deer carrying SARS-CoV-2 across American forests, have appeared as ghosts hunting humans to potentially transmit this pandemic virus. So the idea of an animal vengeance for zoonosis is a very strange one for modern societies who make a strong separation between humans and non-humans in their intellectual capacities. This mode of reasoning is closer to hunter societies who attribute intentionalities to animals and plants in order to mark the differences between specific materialities. But despite this very bizarre idea of intentionality, the concept of animal reservoir is very scientific. It designates a space where viruses mutate from wild to domestic species through a form of latent life. In my ethnographic work, I have questioned the notion of animal reservoir, which is at the heart of global techniques of management of zoonosis. When an avian influenza is detected by health authorities, birds living on the territory are controlled, monitored, and sometimes killed to eradicate the animal reservoir. The concept of animal reservoir is linked to the conception of viruses emerging from wild animals, such as birds for influenza or bats for coronaviruses, and then transmitted to domestic animals and then to humans, a mechanism conceived through the concept of spillover. Like a water reservoir, a wild population seems quiet at the limits of the human habitat until dams break and water spills over. Virologists have to monitor animal reservoirs just as hydrologists have to monitor water reservoirs to send early warning signals of a disaster, either a flood or a pandemic. Through this metaphoric transfer, birds are conceived as water, that is, as movements of a water whose disruption can be anticipated by modelization of water circulation in the case of flood, of viral mutations in the case of pandemic. Along with the anthropologist Christos Linteris and his team at the University of St. Andrews, we have traced the concept of animal reservoirs to the work of microbiologists and epidemiologists who followed the transmission of plague from rodents to humans in the French colonies and the transmission of trypanosomiasis from livestock to humans in South Africa. In particular, Mateus Alves Duarte has shown that Brazil was a central place in this history, since the concept of sylvatic plague was probably coined here in the 1930s to understand how plague could return from rodents living in the forest when the disease was controlled by the eradication of rats in the cities. Another historian in this group, Charles Scott Browse, has shown that the natural reserves in South Africa were a major site for the conceptualization of animal reservoirs between veterinarians and wildlife managers. This conceptual history has led me to hypothesize that an animal reservoir is not only a black spot in epidemiological mapping, requesting the conquest of scientific knowledge, which is often what we hear when we have the term virus hunters. Rather, relying on the anthropology of hunting societies, I have showed that when virus hunters map animal reservoirs, they take the perspective of animals to understand how microbes can move from wild to domesticated habitats through what Christos Linteris has called zoonotic diagrams. So mapping animal reservoirs is a space of exercise for what I have called synergetic power, which draws on what Lévi-Strauss has named wild thought. In 2008, in the re-edition of La Pensée Sauvage, for the edition of his works in the Bibliothèque de la Pléiade, Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote, I quote, this is the second quote in my slide, "Whether one deplores it or rejoices in it, zones are still known areas in which wild sort, like wild species, is relatively protected. Such is the case of art, to which our civilization gives the status of a national park, with all the advantages and disadvantages attaching to such an artificial formula. So this statement in 2008 could be read as a conservative stance prescribing the confinement of beings in protected spaces such as museums or natural reserves to remove them from the grip of time. This is the usual critique that is made of Lévi-Strauss. But rather, I think it should be read as a call for the creation of spaces where living beings can express all their possibilities outside of any imperative of yield, rendement is the term used by Lévi-Strauss, or performance. In his last lectures at the Collège de France, Lévi-Strauss was interested in the monkey parks on the outskirts of Japanese cities where humans could interact with apes in the wild. These parks, he said, escaped the opposition between the national park, created far from cities to protect the nature separate from humans, and the zoological park, located in the heart of cities, like a museum or laboratory, to provide the cultural spectacle of nature. Instead, this ape park, or monkey park, should be conceived as reserves in which modes of interaction between humans and non-humans are preserved at the boundaries of human collective with a view to replenishing them when they become exhausted. Lévi-Strauss described wild sort, that is, the sort constituted by names given to being in nature rather than by mathematical models like domesticated thought, not as a rigid, arbitrary symbolic order, but as a classificatory dynamic that absorbs the contingency of the universal, as a classificatory dynamic that extends toward the universal and the particular. It can be conceived as a thermodynamic machine that absorbs the contingency of events to cool them down by giving them a necessary place in a pre-existing classification system. With regard to proper names, among the Tiwi, a group in New Zealand, who forbid certain names in order to recharge them with energy, Lévi-Strauss writes, and this is the third quote, many names are kept in reserve, constituting a kind of onomastic fund on which it is praiseworthy to draw. Lévi-Strauss's comparison between national parks and museums become clearer in the light of this passage. We can conceive these parks as banks in which living beings are kept in reserve, in a sacred form, to produce more energy when they are reintroduced in ordinary classification. Hence the dynamic of the savage mind, which produces the sacred by the distinction between the ordinary and the extraordinary. This interpretation sheds light on the often misunderstood assertion that hunter-gatherer societies that anthropology deals with are without history or cold. And I quote Eduardo Kohn, who's very inspired by Lévi-Strauss. What is cold here is not exactly a bounded society. For the forms that confer on Amazonian society this cold characteristic cross the many boundaries that exist both internal to and beyond human realms. And this is from How Forests Think. So we can say that parks and museums cool down time in the sense that they sequence the linear arrow of time, which is characterized by acceleration and warming, to record it within other timelines stored in their reserves. Lévi-Strauss thus opened the way for what the anthropologist Emma Koval and the historian of science Joanna Radin have called the cryopolitics. By this term, they designate technologies of preserving latent life in laboratories, museums, zoological parks, and natural reserves. Taking up the formula with which Michel Foucault characterized biopolitics, Emma Koval and Joanna Radin define cryopolitics as a paradoxical way of acting on living beings so that they remain frozen. I quote them, suspended animation and action that produces a zone of existence where beings are made to live and not allowed to die. Such a paradoxical structure of biopolitics thus opens up investigations into the thresholds at which it is decided which living beings will die and which will not. I quote them, "Cryopolitics is a politics of the liminal. It inheres when life is phantomatic, vacillating and ambiguous, when life is not itself." So the beings that are preserved by cold storage in laboratories, museums, zoological parks and nature reserves are not just archives of the past or indicators of the future, like ice cores used to measure climate change over time, but living beings awaiting a second life, whose first life is the object of a knowledge of conservation. I have used the term cryopolitics in my own work to understand how virus hunters move from detecting early warning signals of pandemic viruses when monitoring animal reservoirs to storing these viruses in their laboratories and stockpiling vaccines to protect human populations from emerging infectious diseases. This conceptual strategy was a way to avoid the plot theory, arguing that virologists invent viruses to scare governments and populations in such a way that they buy vaccines for a pandemic that never arrives. And this is an idea that has been very often used when debating about COVID-19 as a biopolitical phenomenon. Such a plot theory doesn't pay attention to the minute work of virologists when they collect and analyze viral sequences. And this error is very similar to the philosophical use of anthropology in the media when journalists ask anthropologists about the invariance of the human mind without paying attention to the specimens collected by anthropologists across the world on which they build their theories. So I want to end my talk on the lessons I have drawn from biology when thinking about this famous statement discussed between Lévi-Strauss and Lévi-Brühl, the boar are parakeets. Virologists collect zoonotic specimens, just like Lévi-Strauss and other anthropologists have collected ethnographic specimens. So in the same way as the research on animal reservoirs cannot be reduced to plot theory, Lévi-Strauss's savage mind cannot, or wild thought, cannot be reduced to philosophical claims about the human mind and closed societies in the context of the debate between existentialism and structuralism in the 1960s. Both Lévi-Strauss's savage mind and virologist's work are calls to attentively map relations between humans and non-humans through the science they exchange. This is why the historical work on the collections made by Lévi-Strauss with boar featherworks is not a way to reduce the bold philosophical claims he made in his book. Lévi-Strauss collected featherworks in the 1930s, just like birdwatchers and virologists collect data about bird migrations today. While the materiality of these specimens have changed, we still need to understand how these signs work under a latent life to better inhabit a world threatened by global disasters and invent what virologists have called a planetary health. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Frédéric. As I commented in the beginning, I would just make like short comments and then you answer if you want or not. And then we can open the discussion to the public. Well, as you can imagine, I read your text and I followed your conference today with great interest. And in my comments also, and as you can imagine, I will address the topics that interest us both in the project about Coleções, compartilhadas, the USP-Cofecub project, about the museums and the objects collected by Claude and Dina Lévi-Strauss. Your perspective brings a very interesting contribution because it moves us away from both the history of collections and the history of art, leading us to consider other issues, perhaps more in dialogue with contemporary anthropological theory and debates. And your remarks take me to many places, like your presentation. But I try to focus on just one thing, or maybe two. In the 1930s, Lévi-Strauss says, and if I'm not wrong, he was more explicit about it in a letter to Marcel Mauss, even if he repeats the idea elsewhere, that the Cajuel people will disappear in 10 years. The same idea goes for the Bororo. Maybe that's also why he and Dina were interested in collecting and keeping objects in museums. We know that the discussion is more complex than that, but that could be a motivation. And based on today's discussions on your conference, I wonder if we could consider if the objects were also for them like sentinels, foretelling catastrophe, the disappearance of the indigenous people, or if they were instead or also a reservoir of indigenous knowledge. I would be happy if you could reflect on this together now or in the following of the project. And well, these indigenous people didn't disappear. That's quite the opposite. The Bororo were in Paris 2 weeks ago. And I found it very interesting when you mentioned that Lévi-Strauss compares nature conservation to artwork. I've been thinking about these parallels with a colleague that is not here today, Guilherme Fagundes, also a professor in the anthropology department, these parallels between nature and art institutions. And it also makes me think about Claude Lévi-Strauss' position during the opening of the Cabernet Museum, but that's another story that I will not touch. But right after this part in your conference, you mentioned that Lévi-Strauss was interested late in his career in parks in Japan where people interacted with wild animals like monkeys and hippos. These parks would be neither classical conservation parks away from the big cities in the middle of nowhere, nor museums or zoos, these places of spectacularization of nature or culture in city centers. They would be, and I quote you, what you just said, a call for the creation of spaces where living things can express all their possibilities outside any imperatives of youth. If these Japanese parks were counterparts to classical zoos and conservation parks, I wonder what their museums equivalent might be. That is, museums that would be neither mere conservation nor a spectacle, which once again makes me wonder what Claude Lévi-Strauss himself would think of museums today and of South American indigenous museums, especially considering that indigenous people have not disappeared. The question of neither conservation nor spectacle seems like a good one to me, and I identify an insight in your presentation, your conference, that could help us to think about the word of conservation, both of nature and of culture, or if you want, of parks, laboratories, botanical gardens, or ethnographical and natural history museums. Well, that's the idea that parks, laboratories, and museums cool down time in the Lévi-Straussian sense, not because they obliterated time, but because they eliminate a necessarily linear or chronological and then Western direction of time. In short, museums and parks, and I would say also scientific laboratories, have this technology, as you said, of recoding timelines by conserving objects or species. This conservation or distortion of time, as you suggest, would also have the potential to produce or store more energy, as you said, and I would say also more relations, precisely by moving away from conventional or linear classifications of time. This seems genuinely interesting to me, and I would say why. When we were in Paris last month with the Bororo consulting the Lévi-Strauss collection, Paula was there too, Neva told us repeatedly that what had struck her most about the collection was how it didn't seem as old as it actually is. For her, it was strange to experience this jumbling of time caused by the physical preservation of objects that under other conditions, the conditions of the village, for example, would have deteriorated or disappeared. This caused her sadness, as it was like having contact with things from her very ancient relatives, because it was the same clan, without the evidence that they actually lived and died a long time ago. But, as she also told us repeatedly, This was also precisely what most fascinated her during the consultation. Similarly, Antonio, also a Bororo man that was with us, repeatedly said that the objects fascinated him because they materialized, it was his words, what existed only for him only in orality, and thus in I would say in an immaterial or intangible form, which is the existence of the Kejari village visited by Claude and Dina Lévi-Strauss, which was abandoned in the 1960s after the intrusion of agribusiness and land conflicts. To conclude my brief comments, I understand that these observations, the indigenous ones, converge with the idea of cryopolitics that you mentioned, and the technology that museums of ethnography and natural sciences, and also laboratories, botanical gardens, etc., possess this technology to preserve or freeze. And here again, I think that's very interesting, this parallel between cryopolitics and code history of Lévi-Strauss. But they have this technology of freeze a latent or dormant life of objects, animals, virus, human remains, blood samples, etc. As you mentioned, these entities often enjoyed a first life, which was or still is normally the subject of study and anthropological, biological, immunological, museological study. Then we are really beginning the project studying the collection of Lévi-Strauss collections, trying to understand what it was. But also the samples, the objects, the pieces that are in these institutions, they still wait a second life, which is the new possibilities or relations that they still can engender. It had never occurred to me to think of these terms and associations with virus, the species, and laboratories when considering the objects collected by Dina and Claude Lévi-Strauss, and for that I have to thank you so much. However, I think that while these concepts make sense when you think about Western institutions of memory and science, we start to have some proofs, some evidence that they also make sense ethnographically for the indigenous people as we begin to understand indigenous people's relations with their collections. In this sense, and I think it would be interesting to hear from you on this if you want, I wonder if we don't have an avenue here to think about, on the one hand, indigenous and non-indigenous perspectives on the conservation of nature and culture, so to speak, nature and culture, and on the other hand, the possible relations of indigenous people, not only with museum collections or ethnographic museum collections, but also biological collections. And for example, plant samples in botanical gardens, human remains in museums, and genetic material in laboratories, since these are areas that normally we don't dialogue that much, at least in Brazil. Then these are my comments if you want to answer, or we can open the discussion.
Thanks for these wonderful comments. I would just answer one of your questions, and maybe this will lead me to return to some of the thoughts that you shared. And I'm happy that it was inspired by my reflection. So the question you asked is what would be the equivalent of the Japanese monkey park for museums, and so it would be a museum that has a relation to a wild nature that is not preserved outside of the city but brought inside the city as a potential site of interaction. And I was thinking of the Musée du Quai Branly, where I worked for 4 years, which has many featherworks in its collections, not only those of Claude Lévi-Strauss, but many other featherworks from other societies, and which also has a garden. And in this garden there's a pond, and on this pond there are ducks. Yeah. And these ducks sometimes get sick, and there are people who take care of the ducks, and there are visitors who interact with the ducks. And there was initially a plan for the museum to have an open storage. So now the storage is under the ground, and it's also very threatened by the flood of the River Seine. But if it had all what you see from the garden to the museum, the building itself, there should have been an intermediary level with the open storage. And I find it interesting. It was not possible for technical reason, but the idea that there's a space where you see the exhibitions, there's a space where you interact with nature, and there's the open storage in the middle. And that's a way to think about the vulnerability, the fragility of the collections. And this is a debate I have a lot with the museum curators, is how do you narrate the fragility of the collections. And so one of the ways to narrate them is to put the museum in a garden where there's plants and animals, and that's really a kind of savage mind or wild thought in the sense of Lévi-Strauss. I wanted also to come back to one of your comments on the different timelines in wild thought in the sense of Lévi-Strauss. This is an idea that I didn't bring in my talk, but it's really one of the images of thought that I had in the sense of Deleuze when reading Lévi-Strauss, is that you should not think of thought as a statement or a state of mind, as analytic philosophers do, but you should think of thought as a millefeuille. I think it works in Portuguese. Thought is feuilleté. That's the idea of Lévi-Strauss. Or it's like let's leave the kaleidoscope. It's feuilleté in the sense that it's Marxist. It's a reading of Marx. There's a contradiction, and at a very concrete level of social life, and it is solved by wild thought, by different levels of abstraction, from classification of plants and animals to classification of stars and numbers. And so this is the idea of Lévi-Strauss, that we should pay attention to the different codes in which mythological thinking expresses itself. So I think this idea of the timelines is very interesting to think about the museums themselves. Often museums, they draw you on a line. They use this very, we will say, Eurocentric notion of temporality. Like when you visit an exhibition, there's a line, and it's also a criticism that has been made to the Quai Branly, is that the line of the permanent exhibition is the tour of the world. So you do a tour of the world from Africa to, or you start with Oceania, then Africa, and you end with America, or you can do the reverse. But there's a line. And the interesting thing with the Quai Branly is that there's not only one line, there are different lines, there's different levels. And I think this is also very faithful to Lévi-Strauss, this idea of different timelines. Now, the last idea on which I wanted to comment on your comments is what does it produce when in these different timelines of wild thought we reintroduce indigenous communities? Because, of course, Lévi-Strauss has lived his life with the idea that indigenous societies would disappear. And for him it was a surprise, and it was inspiring, but it didn't have the tools in some way to integrate the survival of these indigenous societies. He says that in Saudades do Brasil, where he talks about the very complex societies that are now found in Amazonian research, and how they are now engaging themselves, but that is not really integrated into his thinking. So what I've tried to do with this idea of cryopolitics is precisely reintroduce the sharing of collections with indigenous societies, but without projecting on them the Western notion of timeline, and seeing how they bring their own temporalities in this metabolic machine of the museum. And I think we need to understand the museum as a metabolic machine in which indigenous communities reintroduce some energy, precisely because they allow us to understand what it means for a museum to be a cold machine producing heat, using temperature, and I end my comments there. Thank you.
Well, thank you. If we have questions, comments, vocês podem fazer em português ou em inglês, tanto faz. Edu, do Renato. Live.
Well, thank you very much, Frédéric, for the presentation. It's more like a comment than a question. But that's, I mean, as you were talking about reservoirs, and that's and the way you came back to it, and then you finished with the idea of cryopolitics. I was wondering, thinking about some ideas. I'd like to hear your opinion about them. We were just in a trip last week to this area in the border between Brazil and French Guiana, and then I found out that Creole, which is a Creole language based on French, is being classified as a traditional indigenous language here in Brazil. And if you hear Creole on the streets, it's like a French pidgin or French patois. So it's an interesting way. It's interesting how an European language, an Indo-European language, has been classified as a traditional indigenous language in this part of. Can you hear me well? Because
I don't know. Can you hear? Okay. Then, sorry.
And then other things. I mean, things which are connected with the idea of reservoir and the idea of having some kind of like. Correct me if I understood you wrong, but some state of nature that needs to be preserved. I was thinking about the hypo, the narco hypos from Pablo Escobar. I don't know if you know, probably aware of the story. They were introduced by Pablo Escobar. He had a private zoo in Medellin, in Colombia, and then he was captured. He was killed. The animals were taken to Bogota, but the hypos were too big to be taken to Bogota. So they're left in the wild, and then they became feral animals, and then they're infested. There's a part of the Magdalena River where they became feral and wild, out of control. But what's interesting is that there was a paper a few years ago by biologists saying that the hypos, in a way, they're doing what the megafauna, which were extincted back in 15,000 years ago, they're like redoing ecosystemic services that the extinct megafauna, like the large mammals who live here in South America, were like extincted 15,000 years ago. They're doing the same kind of ecosystemic functions that these animals were doing. And I was also thinking about sanctuaries. You're talking about the monkey parks in the Rizos, monkeys in Florida. Were like the sanctuaries for chimps and things like that. But what I'm trying to say here is that there are new forms of nature and natural arrangements, which in a way are a consequence of the actions that we've been taking in the last centuries, maybe in the world, maybe since the beginning of the modern era. And how would this? And I think these places need to be considered as refuges as well, because there's no more nature in a way that we used to conceive. And I'd like to hear you a little bit about this. How can this, new arrangements, adjustments? You talk about viruses; they travel much more than the other examples that I mentioned. I'd like to hear you a little bit about this. How these new arrangements can also conform new forms of refuge in the way you mentioned in the presentation.
Thank you very much for this question. So as you see, I play a lot with this concept of reservoirs, reserves, because it works in French and English. And my book was entitled Avian Reservoirs because I was playing on how the imaginary from the museum allowed me to reflect on the work of the biologists in cities like Hong Kong. But it also leads me to intervene in all this field of experiments on nature. So other notions such as sanctuaries or refugees are really interesting. And so I supervise researches on what is a sanctuary for animalist groups, for example, that are sites of experimentation of different lives with animals that are taken from the industrial systems and that are often exposed to diseases that animals never experience because their life is longer in these sanctuaries. So sanctuary, you often think, it's a space where life will become sacred or where life will become protected or frozen, but it's not. It's a site of experimentation of new relations with animals. And the same for, you were talking about ecosystemic services that's really interesting for these feral animals. So I worked a lot on bats as reservoirs of viruses, and we now understand that if bats harbor so many viruses, it's because they have lived for millennia without contact with humans, but by adapting to different kinds of viruses, because they have a very rich multi-species life in these colonies, like caves. And when they come in relation with human, they can pay some ecosystemic services like pollination. But when they come too close to humans, then they can transmit viruses. So there's this question of proximity and distance, and that's also one of the interesting questions with the reservoir, is that we often think of the reservoir as separated from the human life by a dam. So this idea of the spillover is it's quiet and then it becomes dangerous. But what's interesting is the distance and proximity that makes a reservoir, an abundance of differences, something that is reduced to a risk calculation, for example. So these are the thoughts I wanted to share. But it's really exactly if we use this imagery of reservoir and reserves, how can we look differently at the sites where animals or nature is preserved? Thank you.
So, sorry about my English. So, no, you're not really questioning, just some thoughts, wild thoughts. Because I like it so much, because it's too creative and thoughtful to make this link between Você Sauvage and the problem of zoonotic diseases. So, I couldn't read your text. So only I have this slides. So there's some questions about the first one about Lévi-Strauss. Lévi-Strauss is a thinker. Thinking against entropy.
Yes.
This figure of entropy is clear in the end of his topic.
Mm-hmm.
He speaks about a kind of anthropology. Anthropology will become a kind of anthropology, because differences will be melted.
Mm-hmm.
All we will have is anthropology. So, collections, art, music, that's what I understood, is where structures can live in a world of entropy. So, I was thinking there's something paradoxical on Lévi-Strauss. In the first, in one side we have this idea that indigenous people will disappear. Entropy will reign. But in the other hand, we have structures, myths, mechanisms against entropy, resistance. So it's very interesting this way you bring this image of art as the national park of Você Sauvage, wild plants.
Yeah.
Because art is a way, in this world of domesticated thinking, domesticated thought, of preserving something.
Yeah.
Preserving kind of thought experience that is sort of savage, is not domesticated. So art is a natural park. This is a metaphor he uses in Você Sauvage. But I would ask, for Lévi-Strauss, is accidental art not reducible to the museum form? Is it possible to think art as well as life to Lévi-Strauss in accidental art? So this is the first problem question, I think. The second one is about zoonotic diseases. So I don't know if I could catch exactly your point, but it was super interesting. But I'm thinking about this kind of the problem of zoonotic diseases, and I was thinking about another paradox, because the zoonotic diseases are an effect of relationships between man and animals. But in the other hand, it's as well the effect of reservoir, of letting animals without relation to people. So like cows and birds and stuff. could it bring together this idea of reason and of cryopolitics to the idea of domestication?
Mm-hmm.
So the opposite of français sauvage is domesticated thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So domestication is as well
Mm-hmm.
one of the causes of zoonotic diseases.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem, and there is a problem not only with animals but as well with plants, because we know that this model of monoculture and plantations and stuff are also responsible for this kind of zoonotic disease.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very interesting. You quoted these excerpts from Lévi-Strauss and the saying in the text of Ashford.
Mm.
And in the end, he says, "But we have to free
Yes.
our animals,
Yes.
and we have to go back to the people, indigenous peoples of the plains that hunted bisons." And this is a way of resisting this kind of diseases too.
Yeah.
So, come back to a kind of savage life.
Yeah.
Savage thought and savage life. So
Yeah.
there are some thoughts
Yeah.
share it.
Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for these two sets of questions. So one is more on entropy and the other is more on zoonosis and how to manage zoonosis in a wild thought. And so to answer the first question, I would say that there are many anthropologists who think through thermodynamics before Lévi-Strauss, Bergson, Cournot. It's really this idea. This idea that order is produced out of disorder and energy comes out of it. This is really shared by many anthropologists of the beginning of the 20th century. So what Lévi-Strauss actually brings in this debate is this idea of difference, that energy, the order is produced by combining differences, and that's this semiotic ontology, if you will. And so the idea is that when you combine differences, sometimes it produces disorder, and sometimes it reintroduces order. So that's the kaleidoscope view of the wild thought. Is that sometimes you think there's disorder, but you just twist some angle, and then order is produced. And so there's something like the idea of a threshold, that if you think that you don't see anything because it's disorder, it's because all the elements are not taken through the right point of difference. But if you take a point of difference, then it will produce order. That's he also has this idea that when you take different myths and different rituals, sometimes there is a point of inversion where what seems disorder becomes order. And so that's where I tend to use Lévi-Strauss to think about reservoirs, because we think of reservoirs as separated from human life by a dam. But what if this dam became a threshold where differences allow us to reintroduce order and not disorder? So that's, for example, the idea of bringing bat life to think about immunological system that biologists use a lot. I find it very inspiring. Or to come back to your second question about the meaning of Lévi-Strauss's idea on the mad cow disease. So what does it mean to have all animals released, set free, and keep some animals for surveillance? So you might think it's a very utilitarian way of using some animals as cannibals to monitor the health of the animals that are hunted, that are set free and hunted. But I tend to think about that through this idea of threshold. Is if we want to keep a relation to the animal that are released, then we need to pass through this monitoring animal, which is the cannibal cow. And this connects to the work that is done by my colleagues on domestication. I'm thinking of the work of Charles Stepanov, which is based on the research he makes in Siberia, where the differences between wild and domestic is not the same as in Western societies, where there's wild domestic are outside, domestic animals are in the house, and we need to control the health of the domestic animals. Actually, the difference between, deer, reindeer, are around. Some of them are wild, some of them are domestic, can be used for milk or for meat. And some of the deer are considered as monitoring the rest of the flock. And they are sacred. They carry some signs, some like a piece of tissue, and they are shamanic rituals to make them sacred. So we see that it's not a separation between human, domestic, animal. It's actually a continuum in which some elements produce views on the rest of the animals. And that's I still think this idea of the threshold, and that's why it's a very interesting question you raise. What is the difference between freezing objects in a museum and domesticating animals? And I think if we take this Lévi-Straussian view, the domesticated, taking animal reservoirs as a space of conservation, because that's a criticism that is often made in contemporary literature, is to say, oh, but there's no such thing as wild animals because all the animals are under biopolitics of conservation. And I think it's true. But if we use Lévi-Strauss's idea about cold societies, cold society view on conservation of animals, then we see that these animals allow us to reintroduce diversity, a view of order in an industrial system that has cultivated homogeneity and disorder and pathology. All this goes through the threshold, or a dam is not a barrier. A dam is a threshold. The dam between humans and the reservoir is not a barrier; it's a threshold. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question. I would like to know how do you see the relation between cure and the curing of Lévi-Strauss, because if we
Cure.
Yes.
Cure in the sense of curing, curating.
The disease.
Curing, okay. Mm.
Yes, because if we are talking about the disease,
Yes.
we are also talking about like chickens. There are also soldiers.
Yes.
He doesn't have like this dual thought about it. So my question is like, how might people use cosmology and
Yes.
the ritual use of the feathers as a traditional understanding of the cure that encompasses not only physical
Yes.
but also social and the ecological balances.
Yes.
In contrast of the Western thoughts,
Yes.
how this approach of like how often this isolates the disease from the environments and the culture
Mm-hmm.
scenario.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I quoted the only passage in Savage Mind, La Pensée Sauvage, Wild Thought, on disease, which is this idea that in this group, I don't remember the name of the group. The Indian societies, it doesn't give the name, the Indian societies, Southeast United States. So they give name to diseases by connecting them to animals and plants, and then they explain the diseases by the revenge of the animals or the plants. So it's a way to explain the disease not only biologically, but also socially and environmentally, and it's the classical Evans Pritchard idea that when there's a disease, it's a sign that something has been done in an improper way, and you need to find who is responsible. So curing a disease is also a way to reconstitute order. But what I wanted to show in this talk is that there's not an opposition between the traditional view or indigenous wild sort of diseases and the biomedical views. What I want to show with all this thinking about the sentinels is that the microbiology allows us to map the order of our relations with animals and plants in a way that is as rich as the wild sort described by Lévi-Strauss. And that's why, so I had you repeat your question because I heard curing. When I hear curing, I think of curating. And of course, it's an analogy that is made today in the world of art. But I think it's a very deep, it's not an analogy, it's an association actually of word. But it's a very deep association that when we read Lévi-Strauss, we can understand better, is the idea that when you cure a disease, if you start from the microbes and all the disruption of order that is signaled by the microbe, so what the immunologists call a chain of signaling, that cause this microbe to disrupt your organism, then you can map an order of relations that has been disrupted. So if you take COVID-19, our relation with bats and with mink so it's the sentinel species is not like fighting with an enemy. That's the view I try to move away from. But it's the animal species that is the starting point for an investigation of this map of relation that has been disturbed. Yes.
I was thinking about this idea that the museums slow down time.
Mm-hmm.
But when we think about the museums that are taught by the indigenous people, like in the upper Shimu and all of that,
Yeah.
I think they have a conception that they want to use the materials that are in the collections. So even the people that have this cold history, I think that the museum that they made up in their minds is not a way of coding down time.
Yes.
And I think it's a different relation, like what Malu told about the Bororo in the Quebroni.
Yeah.
I think they made a different perception in the European Museum than what they do when they think about making museum themselves.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to
Yeah.
to hear you about it.
Yeah.
How to think like this coding down museum in a context that I think the museum for them in their lens are like a more warming up time museum.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah. So this is a discussion I have with Eduardo Kohn because he actually now works on a museum in Ecuador. Yes, with some. He actually has a collection of what is that? Ceramics that comes from his grandmother, who was already doing some archaeology in Ecuador, and he's discussing with. I don't know if it's the Runa people, but some people in indigenous groups in Ecuador on how to present these ceramics collected by his grandmother. And what I find interesting is that he wants to move away from identity politics. That is often the way indigenous societies enter museums, like I'm going to tell you my story, and to play on different lights and voices, and also reflect on why these ceramics are here and how have they been conserved, and so this idea of cooling down museums is precisely a way to say indigenous societies are not new actors in these museums. Their gaze is allowing us to show what has been hidden in museums, like what was on storage. And what was on storage was, the only problem was how to freeze them, how to maintain them. And now they tell us, but these objects have a life, that we see how they are made, we see how they can be presented differently. So cooling down museum is also precisely as we do in this project, a way to break the barrier between what is in storage and what is in the exhibition space. Mm-hmm.
The late 20th century social force, French social force. I mean, the power of not allowing something to circulate,
Mm-hmm.
that is associated to the notion of reserving of reservoir.
Yes.
I'm remembering that some idea of reserving is also present in Lévi-Strauss' predecessor,
Yeah.
which is Marcel Mauss' theory of the gift.
Yes.
Keeping plays an important part because, as you know, giving back instantly is a denial of the social link in favor of a market-like relation. So this is, could you please comment on this notion of reservoir
Mm-hmm.
in this predecessor?
Okay.
And the second question is related to the metaphor,
Mm.
because at some point, Christopher Crooker points to the poetic function of the language
Mm-hmm.
embedded in the claim the Borundos are parakeets.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is right, is correct,
Mm-hmm.
but there is a current movement in anthropology called deontological term
Yes.
that, as you know, we usually we treat claims such as this as claims, not as poetical claims, but as claims about the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could you please discuss this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you for these two very important questions. So, keeping while giving, and all this debate about Marcel Mauss, and it's really interesting because so there's all this debate with Annette Weiner, Maurice Godelier, which is also a debate on the museum as a place where things are kept sacred. And they're kept sacred because they are separated from the market. That's basically what I understood from Godelier's reading of Weiner's. And I strongly disagree with that, because precisely the notion of the sacred for Lévi-Strauss is not what is kept out of circulation. The sacred, from my reading of Savage Mind, is this threshold between the ordinary and the extraordinary that allows to put things in reserve so that they reintroduce energy in the system of classification. So, if we come back to Lévi-Strauss's interpretation of Marcel Mauss, I think we should not understand the reserve as a place of preservation in the sense of separation. we should rather think of the reserve as a place for what Lévi-Strauss calls a floating signifier. The floating signifier is all these semantic elements that don't find a place yet in the system of signified. And this idea of the floating signifier, I now connect it to all these debates about ghosts. You know, like I should mention this reference today. Mark Barrow, Nature's Ghosts, which is a wonderful history of knowledges of conservation in the US, with this idea that what naturalists do when they preserve all these specimens in museums is that they build a reserve of ghosts that will haunt in some way modern societies. And that's something that I really understand when thinking of the floating signifier in Lévi-Strauss, and precisely not as a space of the sacred, but as a place that allows to produce sacred forms, or to produce energy by desacralizing and recyclizing. That's Lévi-Strauss's idea. And that connects me to your second point about the ontological turn. So it actually took me a while to read Christopher Crocker, because I started my investigation on Lévi-Brühl, Lévi-Strauss, and all this debate at the moment of the ontological turn. So this idea that the boar are parakeets or humans are birds, often people told me, oh, it's a metaphor. It's just a way of saying. And because of the influence of analytic philosophy in anthropology 20 years ago. And I was strongly against that. And I was starting to read Viveros de Castro and people like that, and I thought, no, we should take seriously the idea that humans are birds. So what is the agency of birds that humans capture when they say they are birds? I mean, that's one of the ways to interpret the ontological term, is to say we should take seriously the statement of shamans who say we become animals, and in this becoming we capture the agency of or the power of the birds. Now, I think if we take seriously this idea of the ontological turn, often there's a way that is there's a path that is not a path. There's a tendency or a diversion that is often meant to say we should give ontologies to all living beings. I mean, this is the enchanted view of multi-species ethnography in some way. And now that I come back to Christopher Crocker, I think what was interesting is the idea of the metaphor is that it frames the difference between wild and domestic in a way that is different from what we do in Western societies. And so what I learned from the ontological term is precisely to question the difference between the wild and the domestic in such a way that we learn how to be haunted by the wild. And I think that's why all my ideas about the animal reservoirs is it's semantic potentialities that haunt societies who think they are done with the problems of the living world by domesticating it. So I hope this answers your two questions.
I don't know, we have time for a last question, if someone have one, or not. No? I think it's fine, right?
Okay, yeah, thanks. It was very inspiring to discuss with such an informed audience about Lévi-Strauss and the challenges of museums today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Par hasard,
Le reçu, oui.
les reçus,
Je pars pas avec.
non,
Je
mais
pars
j'avais
pas
mon
avec.
score déjà qui était bon. Je sais pas qu'est-ce que j'ai fait, j'ai mis le chèque, mais les reçus.
Oui, non, il faut tout garder.
Je suis horrible avec tout ça.
Oh, c'était des super questions. Hein.
Ouais.
Ah ouais. J'étais un peu fatigué, mais j'avais vraiment envie de répondre. Super public, hein. Ça donne envie de poursuivre la discussion.
On a pas plus de l'émission.
Ouais. Non, c'est étonnant parce que quand je fais ce genre de conférence devant un public nord-américain, les gens me disent qu'est-ce que c'est, Lévi-Strauss, c'est vieux et tout ça. Et là, ça me permet de préciser ce que je veux dire. Ouais.
Ah non, mais c'est super intéressant. Il y a des schémas là. Je réfléchissais justement, tu sais qu'on a l'idée de cette numéro au Brésil.
Ah oui?
Oui, alors.
Ah, mais c'est une très bonne idée, ouais.
Ouais, je pense que ça.
D'accord.
C'était Maïra qui
Et
nous
comment-
parlait ça depuis longtemps.
Comment ça pourrait... Parce qu'il ne faut pas que ce soit seulement autour des bourreaux.
Ah bah non, sur les Lévi-Strauss, collections.
Ouais.
Pas que les bourreaux, mais
Ouais.
là, je pense qu'il y a des avenues. Je pense qu'il y a des avenues pour réfléchir ensemble.
Ouais, non, puis... et donc aussi peut-être ces questions de... Qu'est-ce qui se passe quand on fait venir des groupes indigènes dans les musées?
Oui, aussi ça, mais aussi des questions qui puissent... moi, j'aimerais bien que ça soit... qu'il y ait des questions sur les musées, la milieu, la création et tout. Ça,
Oui.
ouais, mais aussi sur, comme tu disais, comment on peut concilier, je sais pas, les activités des collectes de Lévi-Strauss,
Oui.
son œuvre plus théorique et tout.
Voilà, c'est ça,
Voilà, la
ouais.
fin de ton texte, je pense.
Ouais.
À part de tout ça que ça m'a beaucoup intéressé sur comment
Ouais.
on fait, on modifie le timeline et tout.
Ouais, c'est ça, ouais.
Ouais, mais
Oui, je suis un peu fatigué, à vrai dire. C'était dense, j'avais un peu chaud, mais les questions étaient tellement bien que j'ai réussi à... Ah, d'accord, raison.